He did not kneel. The manacle rings were already swallowing his wrist's iron jaws, gnawing at the bone, yet William Wallace kept his spine straight as a drawn sword. London's August dusk lay over Smithfield like a shroud of copper smoke, the market square stench, half mud, half meat, wholly human. Somewhere in that suffocating hush, a sparrow chirped, then stopped as though afraid to interrupt history. 4 great horses, stamped and pulled against the ropes, nodded to Wallace's ankles and wrists, eager without knowing why. The scaffold beams groaned impatient, but the prisoner only gazed at the crowd. An English herald read charges about treason, rebellion, sacrilege. Words afloat on the air, already drowning in disbelief. How can a man betray a crown he never swore to? Wallace's eyes flickered with something like amusement. No answer came yet. Every silent heartbeat became one more stone in the wall. A butcher's boy shoved forward until his breath tasted the smoke of torches and the sour musk of blood dried on hooks. He too waited for the condemned to beg. But the only plea Wallace offered was to the wind and the sky and whatever mercy might live there. Alba gu brath, Scotland forever. Crowd ecstasy swelled, then faltered. They had come for entertainment, not epiphany. Watching a man refuse to bow unpicked seams in their certainty. If chains cannot break him, what can and why? Whispered a timid voice inside each breast. Do we call such defiance a crime? Even the executioner paused, blade in hand, drawn by the gravity of an idea made flesh. Freedom as hide and sinew as marrow, and memory as the terrible privilege of choosing how to die. The hush broke when a soldier jerked Wallace's head-back fingers, threading into sweat-slick hair. The crowd exhaled. The rope tightened. The cart rolled away. Flesh met hemp, life convulsed, and still the body sought the sky. Yet before sinews snapped, the mind had already outrun the moment, racing north across heather and rain, rewinding through 10 blazing years until it crashed against a cradle. Let us chase it. Let us unspool the thread, back to the boy who heard his father's sword hum in the forge, who smelled peat fires, quenched by English boots, who learned early that taxes and shackles speak the same harsh tongue. Let us meet the child who believed. A single heartbeat well spent could drown out centuries of silence. For only by walking the road behind him can we understand why he now walks the last yards unbroken, and why when lungs collapse and entrails burn under English knives, one word, freedom, will ring louder than the bells of Westminster. Rain scribbled across the thatch of Elderslie, and the child William listened. Each patter was a warning, steel soon, or hooves or fire. His mother taught him letters, his father taught him silence. Both lessons shaped a tongue that would one day rattle every drawbridge south of the Tweed. Yet destiny approached softly, a footstep in a forest glade, a glint between leaves until 1297, when England's Sheriff of Lanark hanged young Andrew de Moray for waving a forbidden banner. Wallace measured that creak of rope and felt something sever within himself the cord that holds fear in place. He struck first not as a knight but as a shadow. A patrol found their own garrison door barred from outside, flames licking timbers. Another awoke at dawn to find its standards replaced by a lone thistle threaded through the iron hinges. These were whispers, preludes, the throat-clearing of revolution. Then came Stirling Bridge. Mist curled above the river Forth like stage drapery hiding a brutal set. English infantry, confident and butter-fed, marched single file across a narrow wooden span, swords glinting like parade silver. On the far bank, Wallace waited with men forged from peat and hunger. At his signal, Scottish pikemen crashed against the bridgehead, splintering planks and bodies alike. Horses screamed, riders flailed, and the river feasted. The victory was grotesque, perfect. England learned that day a new arithmetic: one idea plus one moment equals a nation divided from its masters. Wallace walked the field afterward, mud sucking at his boots, and felt triumphs sting like salt in an open wound. Because victory, he sensed, is merely the first sentence in a very long indictment. It invites reprisal, betrayal, and the slow, patient slaughter of hope. And betrayal obliged. Winter brought snow thick enough to muffle hoofbeats in the lowlands and to hush oaths sworn under castle eaves. Sir John Menteith, a compatriot whose smile could slip through keyholes, began to whisper names at English banquets. Gold changes, hands faster than legends. By summer of 1305, Wallace rode with fewer companions, trusting fewer still. Yet each village they passed spilled into the roads to bless him, not as a fugitive, but as the soul of something larger than borders. He answered them with a weary grin, that peculiar smile of men who know the scaffold is stalking them. Capture came not with swords clashing, but with doors opening too easily. At Robe Royston outside Glasgow, Menteith's men surrounded the house while Wallace slept. One of his last loyal friends, Curly, reached for a dagger. Wallace touched his arm, shook his head. Some fights can only shrink a cause. Shackles close cold and final. Yet within them, Wallace felt a curious lightness, the gravity of leadership lifting at last. They dragged him south in a jolting cart, English flags snapping above like crows quarreling over carrion. Wallace's thoughts went far, far north, back to forests he'd never see again. In the Tower of London, stone corridors exhaled mildew older than crusades. Guards whispered that the Scottish rebel would beg before sunrise. Wagers passed, tankards clinked. Wallace, starved and sleepless, noticed dust motes spinning in torchlight and thought of snowflakes over Stirling Bridge. One English priest dared ask whether he sought confession. Wallace replied almost kindly, "I confess nothing but love of my country, and that sin I will repeat in every world God builds." The priest stepped back as though from flame. Trial followed a spectacle held in Westminster Hall. Banners draped like theater curtains, King Edward's judges seated high as idols. Charges rattled off: murder of civilians, arson of abbeys, refusal to bow, crimes stitched together with the threadbare logic of conquest. Wallace's answer broke the hush: "I cannot be a traitor, for I owe you no allegiance." The hall crackled, half disbelief, half awe. And for a shard of a second, even the judges seemed to wonder which side of the dais stood upon firmer ground. Sentence poured over him, all the same, hanged, drawn, quartered, displayed. Not execution, exhibition. England would make his agony its billboard. Days in the cell bled one into another. Somewhere above, masons hammered new rings into Traitor's Gate to accommodate the crowds expected on August 23rd. Wallace traced the stone floor with a fingertip, mapping memories: his father's laugh cut short by arrows, the taste of Bannockburn water. Night before the execution, a jailer Scots, by the lilt of his curse words, smuggled in a crust of bread. He could not meet Wallace's gaze, yet the gesture was enough. It said, "Your body may be ours, but your name wandered off long ago beyond every wall we know how to raise." Morning unveiled Smithfield like a stage on opening night. Vendors hawked pies beside headsmen sharpening blades, proof that commerce and death share appetites. Wallace was stripped, lashed to a hurdle, and dragged through London's streets. Children chased the cart laughing, because laughter is contagious and ignorance cheaper than bread. Others wept in doorways, unsure whether grief itself might be treason. At the scaffold, they hanged him until breath teetered, not toppled, then cut him down to feel the world come roaring back. Ropes bit welted purple rings around his neck. Every gasp tasted of horses and axle grease. Then the knives. Abdomen opened like a curtain yanked aside. Intestines eased out, flopping wet on straw. Someone in the crowd fainted. Someone else cheered. Pain flooded nerve paths faster than language can travel. Yet Wallace found words raw and ragged: freedom. A shout so torn it could have been laughter or thunder. A sound that slapped the mob into stunned silence. If agony is unavoidable, he seemed to say, let it purchase meaning. Hands gloved in gore severed his head. 4 limbs followed, ferried away to Newcastle Barrack, Perth Stirling, each piece an English love letter to fear. Finally, the torso, emptied and husked, was hoisted aloft in an iron cage by Aldgate. There it would sway in salt wind and soot, a warning visible miles beyond the city walls. But warnings run both ways. Travelers from the north paused beneath those bleached remains and felt resolve, not dread. Every gust rattling the cage made a small metallic whisper that ears translated into one syllable: remember. Years later, when Robert the Bruce drove spear points into English ranks at Bannockburn, veterans swore they heard a distant cry, threading the din, a word flung once in Smithfield that refused burial. And centuries hence, when another empire somewhere tried to chain another rebel, somewhere else the story resurfaced like a revenant demanding an answer to the same eternal question: what precisely can steel accomplish against a conviction? So the man in chains became a phantom unbound. His body could rot in quarters, his head blackened on a pike. But the idea that animated those sinews slipped. The scaffold walked across rooftops into ballads, into law courts, into every corner where a people measure the price of their own voice. Sometimes the cost is light, sometimes unbearable, but always payable. Because Wallace paid first in full, screaming the receipt into the face of power. Freedom. The word had no finality, no period. It was an ember ignited in a tempest swept far beyond the bounds of its origin. It smoldered through the centuries, surviving the fires of kings and wars. The years, like weathered pages, turned slowly, but could not erase what Wallace had made clear, that a life devoted to a cause bigger than oneself, though broken leaves behind a truth impossible to bury. In every heart where chains now formed, it whispered, insistent, unrelenting, "We are not slaves, we are not victims." And in those fleeting moments when the winds were right, when history was poised to listen, the cry of Scotland of freedom resonated again. The faces changed, generations passed, but the spirit lived on, caught in the shadows of every rebel who dared to raise his voice. And that is why, even in death, Wallace continued to move. He was not an echo. He was a pulse, constant and unstoppable. When the last of his physical remains was lost to time, his legend endured in the words spoken at every gathering of the oppressed, in every field of battle where men and women stood against their masters. Wallace had become an eternal part of the revolution. At moments when empires grew too proud, when kings believed they were gods, those who knew the story of Wallace understood that true power does not lie in the throne or the sword. It lies in the will to stand for something greater than oneself, to never kneel. The story of Wallace never truly ends. It is carried in the hearts of those who will not be bound, in every mind that refuses to submit to tyranny. As long as there is breath, the freedom he championed will never fade. His life was a spark, and sparks never die. In every corner of the earth where people yearn for freedom, Wallace's spirit whispers. His legacy did not just live in the past, it grew intertwined with the pulse of every revolution, every resistance. It was in the fire that ignited the hearts of those who dared to hope. And still, long after his body had been torn asunder, Wallace's name was spoken with reverence, with anger, and with a promise. For those who remembered his words, his conviction became a spark that refused to be snuffed out, even by the darkest powers. His story was passed down in songs and ballads, sung in the flickering light of fire pits, echoing through the valleys, where once the earth trembled beneath the boots of soldiers. Each telling of his tale became another layer of his immortality, undying, steadfast. For in the telling he lived on. In the retelling of his death, Wallace was resurrected each time a man or woman stood in defiance, each time the cry for freedom rang out across the land. His name became a call to action, a banner waved in the faces of those who sought to silence the oppressed. And even in the shadow of kingdoms where blood and iron were the language of rule, the story of Wallace rippled through time. His death did not mark an end, but the beginning of something far greater, an idea that could not be imprisoned or silenced. In every society where the chains of tyranny were felt, Wallace's name was invoked. It wasn't just the Scots who called upon his legend. His struggle was universal. It was the struggle of the oppressed of every nation that stood against the weight of unjust rule. And so, even as the years passed and the world changed, Wallace's story did not fade into the mists of history. It remained a beacon, a reminder that some ideals were worth dying for: freedom, justice, dignity. A man's body could be broken, but his ideals could never be crushed. The idea of Wallace endured because it was more than just a memory, it was a living thing. It continued to move in the hearts of rebels, revolutionaries, and dreamers. It was the spark that flickered in the hearts of those who believed, even when it seemed impossible to hope. From the ashes of his martyrdom rose a truth that transcended any one man or any one rebellion. The fight for freedom is eternal, and it does not bow to tyranny. It only grows stronger with every blow. The people of the world from all walks of life carried it with them. In the end, Wallace's execution did not mark the defeat of his cause. It was the moment the cause truly began, for in his death the seed of freedom was planted. And like all seeds, it would grow, spreading roots that would nourish generations yet to come. The world had changed, but Wallace's spirit was ever present, woven into the fabric of every movement that sought to free the oppressed. In every city, every town where the chains of tyranny were felt, his name became a cry for justice that would never fade into obscurity. Through wars, revolutions, and the endless struggle for autonomy, Wallace's legacy was carried like a torch passed from hand to hand. The flicker of that flame, sparked in the heart of one man, grew into a roaring fire that could not be extinguished by kings or conquerors. In every protest, in every battle for freedom, Wallace's name echoed in the hearts of those who dared to rise against the forces that sought to crush them. His life had been a testament to the idea that no matter how great the empire, no matter how ruthless the enemy, the will of the people is greater. And in the quiet moments when the world paused to catch its breath, the memory of Wallace lingered in the air like the wind against the hills of Scotland. It was a whisper carried across centuries, reminding those who listened that freedom is not a gift, it is a fight, one that never truly ends. His story was not just one of war and defiance, it was a story of sacrifice. Wallace did not seek glory for himself. He fought for something greater, for the freedom of a nation, for the dignity of the people. And in his death, he left behind a legacy that would inspire generations to come. As the years passed, new heroes rose in the wake of Wallace's sacrifice. Some wore crowns, some wore rags, but they all carried the torch of freedom that he had lit. His life became a model for those who would not bend, who would not bow, who would not let the dream of liberty die. Wallace's sacrifice was not in vain. His life became the foundation upon which the future was built. The walls of oppression trembled in the face of the idea he had planted, and though he had been torn apart, his vision remained unshaken, a force that would grow stronger with every new struggle for freedom. When nations rise against their oppressors, they remember Wallace. His name is invoked in the streets and the halls of power, in the hearts of those who refuse to be silenced. He is not just a symbol of Scotland, he is a symbol of every struggle, every resistance, every fight for justice. And so in the quiet moments of reflection, when the world feels heavy with the weight of injustice, the memory of Wallace stirs. It serves as a reminder that freedom is not easily won, but it is worth the price. It is a battle that must be fought again and again with the courage of a single soul willing to stand against the tide. For Wallace's story, though, told in a dark moment of history, transcended that darkness. It became a light that would continue to burn, igniting the hearts of all who would fight for what is right. His execution was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of something far greater. Though his body was gone, Wallace's influence rippled across time. His name carried on through the voices of the oppressed, through the song sung in the face of tyranny, through the cries of freedom that filled the air, echoing across borders, undeterred by the passage of time. Every time a nation rose against an unjust ruler, the stories of Wallace's bravery came alive once again. His defiance, his refusal to be subdued, was passed from generation to generation, inspiring countless individuals to challenge the chains that sought to bind them. Even in the face of the darkest hours, Wallace's words lived on. Freedom he had declared, and it was a word that would not be forgotten. It was a call to arms, a reminder that even in death, his conviction was far stronger than the chains of oppression. From the heart of Scotland to the farthest reaches of the world, Wallace's story was passed along like an unbroken thread. His courage continued to fuel the fire of those who would never stop fighting for justice, for equality, for a world where freedom is not a privilege, but a right. And so each time the oppressors thought they had silenced the call for freedom, the flame of Wallace's spirit reignited, catching the winds of revolution once more. He had become a force of nature, an idea that could not be destroyed by violence or tyranny, an idea that lived in the hearts of the brave. In history's darkest moments, when all hope seemed lost, the stories of Wallace became the beacon. They reminded the world that there was always a price to be paid for liberty, but the price of submission was far steeper, and the spirit of resistance would never yield. Through the centuries, rulers rose and fell, but the one thing that remained constant was the belief in freedom. And Wallace, though long dead, was still very much alive in that belief. His sacrifice was not a final act. It was a moment in a greater struggle, one that would never be over. Wallace's death had been a brutal spectacle designed to break the spirit of the people, but instead, it had strengthened it. His body may have been torn apart, but the idea of freedom could not be so easily shattered. It grew stronger, fueled by his martyrdom, and carried on through every new generation. In every corner of the earth where the chains of oppression were still felt, Wallace's name echoed not as a memory, but as a call to action. He was no longer just a man, he was a symbol. And in that symbol, the idea of freedom, the very essence of resistance, lived on. The final act of Wallace's life was one of unimaginable sacrifice, but it was also one of profound triumph. His legacy endured because of his unwavering conviction, because he had given everything for the cause. and that cause, freedom, remained forever in his name. The world around him shifted, but Wallace's message endured. Even centuries after his death, people continued to fight for the freedom he had dreamed of. In every struggle, his spirit stood as a reminder that no one can truly be free until all are free. His story was not one confined to a single battle or a single land. It was a story for the world, for every nation that had ever been oppressed, for every individual who had ever stood against the tide of injustice. Wallace had become the embodiment of the human spirit's refusal to be conquered. Every time a revolution rose, every time a people fought for their rights, they invoked Wallace's name. He was a hero to the voiceless, a warrior for those who could not fight for themselves. His story was the fire that ignited the hearts of the brave, the defiant, and the oppressed. In every corner of the world where people struggled for autonomy, Wallace's story was told. It was shared by fathers to sons, by mothers to daughters. It was carried on the wind, carried in the streets during protests, and whispered through the walls of prisons where the chains of tyranny could not silence it. The idea that Wallace had fought for lived on beyond his death, beyond the borders of Scotland. It traveled across oceans, across continents, spreading like wildfire wherever people dreamed of freedom. He had planted a seed, and that seed grew into a global movement for justice and equality. His legacy was immortalized not just in monuments, but in the hearts of those who believed in a world free from oppression. His death had been a sacrifice, but it had also been a victory. For in that moment of unimaginable pain, Wallace's spirit had been born anew in the hearts of countless others. When the powerful tried to crush hope, when they tried to extinguish the light of freedom, the people remembered Wallace. They remembered his sacrifice and were inspired to rise up once more, to take up the mantle of resistance and to carry forward the banner of liberty that he had borne. As time wore on, the empires that had once sought to suppress him crumbled, but the memory of Wallace endured. The dream of freedom he had fought for was not bound by the fall of kingdoms, nor by the rise of new powers. It was a dream that would continue generation after generation. And so Wallace's story was told again and again, each retelling a reminder of what was possible when a single man stood firm in his conviction. Each new generation found in him a symbol of courage, an example of what it meant to fight not for oneself, but for the greater good of all. Through every retelling, Wallace's spirit lived on. He had become more than just a man, more than just a hero. He had become an idea. And ideas, once they take root, can never truly be killed. They grow, they spread, and they become the foundation upon which future generations build their own fights for freedom. In the face of every new injustice, Wallace's name was invoked again. He was no longer just a part of history. He was a part of the future, a constant reminder that freedom cannot be taken for granted. His legacy pushed those who fought for justice to remain steadfast. Through the darkest moments when all seemed lost, the people remembered Wallace's defiance. His spirit did not waver even in the face of death. It was this unwavering strength, this refusal to bow, that had turned him into a symbol that transcended borders and time. Wallace had fought for the people, and now the people fought for him. His name was carried by every revolutionary, every freedom fighter, every dreamer who refused to let the forces of tyranny control their destiny. He had become the heartbeat of every resistance movement. As nations rose and fell, the dream Wallace had fought for remained unbroken. It could not be erased, no matter how much power or force was used against it. His sacrifice had been the spark that set the world ablaze with the desire for freedom and equality. Wallace's story was one that inspired not just men, but also women, children, and the forgotten voices of history. It was a story that reached across all boundaries, race, class, and geography, because the fight for freedom was universal, and Wallace's death was a battle cry for all to hear. Each time a new generation rose to challenge their oppressors, Wallace's spirit was there cheering them on. He was the embodiment of courage in the face of overwhelming odds, and every struggle for justice was a testament to the enduring power of his sacrifice. The idea of freedom that Wallace had fought for could not be confined to a single moment in history. It was a force that would continue to grow, evolve, and inspire. As long as injustice existed, the flame of Wallace's spirit would continue to burn, lighting the path for those who dared to follow. His execution, designed to break him, had only made him stronger. In his death, Wallace had become a legend. And legends, as time proved, have a way of becoming more than mere stories. They become the foundation upon which future generations build their own battles for justice. In the years following his death, the people of Scotland and eventually the people of the world understood the true meaning of Wallace's sacrifice. It was not just about freedom for one nation, but freedom for all nations. It was a message that would resonate for centuries to come. Though his body had been torn apart, his vision remained intact. Wallace had given his life for a cause far greater than himself, and that cause, freedom, would never die. His legacy was eternal, carried by the countless voices who continued to fight for the world he had dreamed of. With each passing year, Wallace's story was retold each time with new fervor. His death was not just an end, but a beginning of a never-ending fight for freedom. The echoes of his defiance rang through the streets of every nation that longed to break free. As the centuries unfolded, new heroes emerged who took up the mantle of Wallace's fight. They wore different faces, came from different places, but they all shared the same spirit. The spirit of resistance, the spirit of Wallace lived on in the hearts of those who fought for justice. In the face of every tyrant, Wallace's legacy was invoked. His name was whispered in the hearts of those who would not bow. It was a name that inspired courage, that fueled the will to rise up against those who sought to keep the people in chains. Wallace's story was no longer just a tale of one man, but a tale of all people who dared to challenge injustice. It was a symbol, a banner under which the oppressed could rally, knowing that the fight for freedom was not a solitary struggle. It was a collective battle that would never be forgotten. His sacrifice, though brutal and unjust, had ignited something far greater than a rebellion. It had sparked a movement, a global wave of resistance that stretched far beyond the borders of Scotland. Wallace's fight for freedom became the fight of the world. Every time the oppressors thought they had silenced the cry for freedom, Wallace's name reverberated in the hearts of those who refused to be crushed. It was a reminder that no matter how dark the hour, the dream of liberty would always find a way to survive. The world had changed in ways that Wallace could never have imagined, but his spirit remained the same. It lived on in every freedom fighter who took up arms against tyranny, in every protester who stood in the streets demanding justice, in every person who refused to submit. Wallace had given everything for the cause of freedom, and in return his name became immortal. It transcended time, transcended borders, and became a universal symbol of resistance. His story was not just one of the past, but a guide for all who would stand against oppression. As long as there were people willing to fight for their rights, Wallace's story would be told. His name would continue to be spoken in the halls of power, in the streets of revolutions, and in the hearts of those who would not bow to injustice. He had become a timeless symbol. And so the story of William Wallace came full circle. From the man who stood tall in the face of tyranny, to the martyr whose sacrifice sparked a global movement, his legacy endured. A legacy built not on the chains that tried to bind him, but on the ideals that he fought for: freedom, justice, and the unyielding will of the people.